Hi, I have the pleasure to host here at the UN News studio today Nick Birnback, the Chief of Strategic Communications at the UN Peace Operations Department. Welcome, Nick. Thanks for talking to us today.
Thanks, pleasure.
So, Nick, I want actually to travel back with you on time to 1999 when you were in one of the most remarkable achievements of the United Nations, which was a referendum for the self-determination of Timor-Leste. So please tell us from the beginning, when this public consultation was being organized, what was your job there and what was the feeling?
Yeah, well, we didn't have a lot of time. I got there in June, and the consultation was supposed to take place in the middle of August. Got delayed by a few days until the end of August, but we had to translate all of the documents into 4 languages. My job was to head up the team that translated them and did the interpretation and to do other public information tasks. And really it was just a sprint. From the moment I got there to the consultation, it was 24/7, and I managed a small team of Timorese staff, of very brave Timorese staff who worked harder than we did and were completely dedicated to making sure that whatever happened, this consultation took place. And ultimately that was the most inspiring part of the whole thing, was the attitude of the Timorese, who were completely determined to make sure that no matter what, that this popular consultation actually took place.
Yeah, and actually there was a huge uptake by the population despite the risks. So how was, in terms of the communication strategy, the efforts to make sure the population would really turn out to vote on the consultation?
I mean, we did everything we could think of. We put up billboards, we put up banners, we had a newsletter in multi-languages, we had radio programs, we had TV programs, we did outreach activities, we drove around in cars with bullhorns announcing stuff, we used local civil society, we had events with local churches, really everything we could think of to get the message out that there was going to be this popular consultation, this process, and that this was the chance for the Timorese to decide if they wanted to move towards independence or towards greater autonomy within the Republic of Indonesia. And that's what we did for the time that we were there. Every waking hour was to try to figure out ways to get this message out as best we could. And we didn't just stay in Dili. We had sub-headquarters in every region of Timor, including in the enclaves, in the island and in the enclaves. And we deployed all of our staff as forward as we could in order to try to make sure that we reached the maximum number of people that we could. We dispersed everybody into the most remote villages as possible. And I think that we really succeeded in that regard. I think everybody really did know that there was going to be this consultation, and I think the numbers of how many people turned out really speak for themselves.
And Nick, let me ask you this. At the time, Timor was occupied by Indonesia for 24 years, which is known as a very violent occupation. So, of course, there was some risks around this whole process. So what can you tell us in terms of threats, fears around this whole preparation, this whole outreach process? There were any, threats and situations that you can?
Yeah, I mean, the occupation had seen a lot of fighting, and there had been, essentially a situation of conflict for over 2.5 decades. Our job was to make sure this consultation took place. Our job was to make sure the Timorese people knew about it, but that was happening in an environment that was very charged. There were pro-autonomy, which is to say pro-Indonesian militia, that were trying to prevent it, and there were real risks at the other side, the pro-independent side, which were being frankly provoked, were going to actually take action as well. I think that there were real threats and real risks on all sides, that the situation in Timor had been really risky and really dangerous and volatile for a long time. Since the occupation took place, there had been a situation of conflict, and this was no different. Add to that the fact that there was this new dimension, which was that there was all these internationals there that were there to hold this popular consultation. No one had ever seen anything like that before. Nobody knew what was going to happen. Nobody knew how the population was going to react. And it was a really charged and volatile time. So it was hugely risky for everybody. What was the most remarkable part about it was the attitude, I think, of the average Timorese, who were just determined to make sure that this popular consultation took place, no matter what was going on, no matter what was happening, no matter what threats they were under, no matter what, they were determined to make sure that the popular consultation took place.
And actually the result was a massive support to the self-determination. Almost 80% of the population voted for this. Do you remember where you were at the moment of the announcement? What was your feeling hearing the news?
Sure. Well, first, for the actual day of the consultation, I was in the territory's biggest polling station in Maliana. And what I remember about that day is that we went and got to the polling station early because we wanted to see it before it opened. And as the sun came up, there were huge lines of people already waiting as the sun came up because they didn't want to miss their opportunity to vote. I'll never forget that, the sun coming up and seeing all the people waiting to vote. It was a remarkable experience. When our SRSG, the head of our mission, Ian Martin, announced the results of the consultation, I was actually on stage right behind him. And it was simultaneously announced in New York by the Secretary General, Kofi Annan. And he made the announcement, and we were looking out over the auditorium in Dili, and this big cheer went up from outside the auditorium, and you could hear it, and we started to hear horns beeping. It was really quite an amazing moment.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can only imagine actually the joy of this moment. But actually, a few days after, the situation turned out completely to a scenario of destruction and violence by the pro-Indonesian militias. And you were at the UN compound at that time. So tell us about that situation where the UN was basically, refuging in the compound to protect the staff from the violence, but actually there were a lot of the local population also in need of protection. So what could the UN staff do in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really dangerous, volatile, confusing time. And what happened was that as the violence started to escalate, we brought all of the staff in Dili first from their accommodations and the outstations into the compound. So the first thing we did was take our presence from the local area and bring it into the compound. Then we started to bring our presence from the regions, and we had spread out as far as we could into the territory of East Timor in order to reach the most number of people in East Timor. So we had people all over East Timor, and we started to bring them back into Dili. And it wasn't smooth. We had people attacked, we had people shot, thank God no internationals killed, but we had some local staff that were killed. It was horrible. And in this moment of incredible tension and violence, we evacuated all of our personnel into the compound from all over East Timor, from all over the territory. Meanwhile, the city of Dili around us was being attacked by these militia groups, and they were burning the city basically around us. And a number of people moved around us in the compound, into the parking lot next to us, because I think they felt that if they were close to the UN, that they would have some measure of safety if they were just close to the UN. But the militia groups started to come closer, and they started to shoot nearby, and it panicked some of these internally displaced peoples or IDPs, and they climbed over the fence into our compound. Now, of course, we did everything we could for them when they were there, but we're an unarmed electoral mission. So we had no ability to protect them, no ability to look after them, really. But on the other hand, we had no choice because we weren't going to turn them out. We weren't going to, toss them out into the arms of the militia. So very quickly we found ourselves in a situation where we were essentially in a state of siege, where we had all these IDPs that were sheltering in the compound with us, all of this international staff that were there, really nowhere for them to go, but also no real ability for us to look after them long term. It was a really dangerous and volatile time.
And can you tell us what role did communications had at the time as a weapon, let's say, to protect the civilians and the UN staff from what was happening?
Yeah, well, so in the compound with us were a number of journalists, local journalists, international journalists, and a lot of the communications equipment had been burned when the city was attacked, including some of the satellite communication. But what we did have was some satellite communications that had been left by one of the media outlets that had managed to leave. So we used that, and it allowed us to communicate with the outside world. It allowed us to answer calls when we got it from the media that wanted to know what was happening. But it also allowed the journalists that were there to file stories every day. And what we did as a strategy was we made sure that there were dedicated times in the day where the journalists that were there, that had stayed, had access to our satellite phone, and that they were able to get the story out. Because what our determination was that because we had no ability to physically push out, to physically defend ourselves or physically force our way out of the compound, that this was a political issue, that we had to put political pressure on the stakeholders who might be able to come up with an agreement to break the siege. And we thought that the best way to do that was to push out a communications message about what was really happening there. So we made sure that the journalists got the story out, including pictures when we could. It was tricky back then to get pictures out, but we did. But wire service stories got to report from there, newspapers got to report from there, others. And we kind of used communications as our best defense, and sort of as the only weapon we had was to communicate as robustly and as actively as we could. And that's what we did, because that public diplomacy ended up being what we needed to buy some time and space for political pressure to be brought to bear. And that's what happened in the end.
And in the middle of this situation, there were some dramatic moments, and one of them was the almost evacuation of the UN staff. Can you tell us about that, and what was the reaction of the UN staff about this process?
I mean, so that, there was a moment where it really became difficult to guarantee the security of everyone that was there, both internationals and the people that were there. And we began to hear that there was going to be an instruction for us to leave. So a petition got circulated that basically said, if asked, would you stay? Are there any volunteers to stay? And really, pretty much everyone I know said, sure, we will absolutely stay, because our view was that if we had left, the people that were there would be at real risk. And that our view was that if we stayed, we had a really high chance that we would be able to protect them, because if the militia groups had wanted to attack them, we didn't have any weapons, they would have already. So we thought that our physical presence was their best chance. And so by leaving, we were removing their defense. So we volunteered to stay. And that gave our head of mission the opportunity to say to New York, yes, we understand that it's a difficult situation, but I have volunteers who are willing to stay anyway. And that, in turn, bought time for more political engagement and more political pressure to be brought to bear, which in turn ended up working and buying us that what we needed, which was time for that pressure to actually work and for it to impact on the stakeholders, to break the logjam and break the siege and figure out a solution to the process.
So you would say that keeping Timor-Leste in the headlines and the bravery of UN staff that decided to stay were key factors in the whole process?
The bravery is the Timorese people. It's not us. We were there. We did the best we could in a difficult situation. The brave people were the Timorese. What we did was we devised a strategy to try to keep the word out there, to get the word out there and to keep the story going, and not to allow the narrative to be shaped by parties to the conflict, to put impartial news out there about what was really happening. And I think that really worked. And in that particular context, it made a real difference. It allowed us to not have the headlines dominated by one side, and for us to have this news put the pressure on the stakeholders in a way that ended up being positive and productive. And in the end, that pressure worked and convinced the parties to allow us not only to leave, but to leave and to take the IDPs with us, which was the key point, because we didn't want to leave without taking them because we felt that they would be a great risk. So we held out long enough for the political process to come to fruition, and they came with us when we evacuated to Darwin. And one other point that I think I should make is the role that the Security Council played in this, because the Security Council came to visit us in Dili, and the Security Council back then came as a unified bloc and made very clear statements as the council, not as individual members of the council, but as a whole council, that they expected all parties to the agreement to live up to their international obligations. It was a very powerful message. And I think it's an example of what can happen when the council's unified. When there's a mission that represents the international community and it's backed by a unified Security Council, a lot is possible. And I think Timor is a great example of that.
Perfect, Nick. And looking to your role today as the Chief of Strategic Communications and Peace Operations, as we know, Timor, after that situation, was hosted several peacekeeping operations. So what do you think makes Timor-Leste also a successful story in terms of peacekeeping? What were the lessons learned in the country?
Yeah, I mean, Timor hosted the whole range of international deployments. It was a transitional administration, it was a large, big peacekeeping operation, there was a smaller peacekeeping operation, then it was a special political mission. It really ran the gamut of peace operations. What it also had was the unified support of undivided Security Council. And I think one of the key lessons is that when you have commitments from the entire peacekeeping and peace operations universe, and when you went to Timor during peacekeeping operations, what you were struck by was how many different countries were there. We had aviation units from South America, we had infantry units from the Philippines and from Thailand and from South Asia, and then Australians and New Zealanders and from all over the world. And when you have that physical manifestation of the commitment of the entire world there, and the council backing it up tangibly, it shows how possible it is for peacekeeping to make a real difference as a country transitions from conflict to post-conflict. And I think Timor's a great example of that. And we're proud that Timor now contributes to peacekeeping. A country that hosted peacekeeping operations now contributes to peacekeeping operations. So I think that's a great story.
Okay. Nick, do you have any final remarks before we close?
Viva Timor-Leste.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing so much stories and reflections about the country.
It's my pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.